Welcome to the J3U University podcast. I'm your host, John Jewett.
And I'm your co-host, Luke Miller.
Our mission is to elevate the physique coaching standard
and deliver the highest level of competitors to the stage.
Let's jump into today's episode. Nandrolone is a thing of the past, or is it? Should it still be used in modern day bodybuilding? It seems like a lot of people have been shifting away from it as of late, and a lot of people are still fans of it, and people bring it up of being the mainstay builder in the off season. And as of lately, you see a lot of people just are not using it quite as much. So we thought we'd dive into is Nandrolone just becoming a thing of the past and no longer mainstay in modern bodybuilding?
Yeah, I think it's hard to argue with something that has been around in the culture and in the industry for so long that we know has generated results in the past for people. And so to me, my tendency is to kind of go towards like the psychological side of the drug of why is Nandrolone a go-to steroid, and is it because of the results, or is there a psychological component? And that'd be kind of where I would pose the question is to you, John, is why do you think Nandrolone has been such a go-to steroid for so long?
Well, you brought up something there for so long. And so we take a trip back in the history books of Nandrolone and its origins to the ancient Russian culture. Now, it was originated in 1960s, right? That's when it came to market. Organon was one of the first brand pharmacy manufacturers for Decadurabolin. So we had Nandrolone Decanate. Deca. This is what was popular. U.S. mainstay 1970s really became popular as well, and that's where we see a lot of the classic era bodybuilding using Nandrolone. In Nandrolone only cycles in the off season, testosterone wasn't as popular as it is now. Because there just wasn't as many drugs present back then, so it was just kind of use what you can. And that was kind of the options. But being that this was what was getting kind of passed down from your previous bodybuilders of using Nandrolone, Nandrolone caused some water retention. So it's not something you use in prep. So you use a lot in off season and get good growth out of it. So I think partly that anecdotal from past bodybuilders just kept passing on and on and on. And eventually, through just experimentation through all these drugs that have come about since then, you kind of fall into categories of where drugs should be used in off season versus in a contest prep scenario. Deca though has been a mainstay for a long time. Even when I was in high school, I think that was one of the first steroids that I even heard a name of. I didn't know what it even meant really. I just do I'm going to run Deca or something. Someone would jokingly say, oh yeah, that guy's running Deca. And I was like, oh no, it's not even it's Nandrolone is what you're running. Deca is the ester part, but so everyone was calling it then. But availability is present. Also high milligram per mil. And I think that and it's cheap. So I think that's drove a lot of decisions around people still utilizing it.
Yep.
And even then, a lot of information wasn't really out. You'd have to go, at least when I was starting to investigate steroids myself, it was you go to forums and read, or they had what was that? Steroids.com. You click on each compound, it'd tell you just some real generalized thing, just if you looked at William Llewellyn's anabolic book. It was very this kind of generalized, here's the history, here's what you might use for a milligram amount of each thing. So there's just wasn't a lot of information out. So you go to forums, which some guys would just you don't know if they're bullshitting on there or not, but again, what they're telling you is probably what their coach was telling them from past coaches or past athletes, just getting passed down and down until you kind of need to ask some questions for yourself and say why am I using these different drugs? Each one, what's the purpose around each one? And that's where you kind of get into, I think, where we jump into more modern day bodybuilding. If we've asked these questions, and there's also now a lot of people that are educating on PDs from their experiences, but also from the scientific literature of what we might know, and have like pushed just and challenged back of older ideologies around cycle design, and kind of seeing more modern approaches taken, and they've been fruitful. So I think that's kind of where we're at in this situation now. One of the first things I ever heard was I was working at GNC. I had someone I was working with, and he was like, I ran out of DECA and I'm now using NPP. And he's like, have you ever heard of that, John? I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. He's like my guy. By referring to the guy, we mean the steroid dealer. Was saying that this was like the same thing as DECA, right? And at the time I had no clue, right? So, but it was like a shorter ester nandrolone derivative, right? So nandrolone, a phenylpropionate, and I think we've seen that used now. That became pretty popular because the issue with DECA being this long ester, take a long time to accrue. And if there was a problem that occurred with DECA, well, gosh, you got to wait several weeks for this thing to adjust to get out of your system. So you saw NPP get fairly popular, but that's kind of where we're at as far as where nandrolone has been at. But it's still been a go-to of choice. So I think we could look at just subjectively why people still like it.
Yeah, because, I mean, nandrolone's got some interesting characteristics. You call them, interesting, unique, whatever word you want to use, where I think there's a large psychological component to nandrolone as to like a yay or nay for some people. And if you need to revisit our previous podcast where we talk about the pump and its utility in hypertrophy, I think that feeling is one of the big psychological reasons people cling to NPP. Because like, John, when you're in that like sweet spot of off season and you've had that nandrolone in like just long enough where you're like so much fuller and the pumps are outrageous, but you're not fat yet. And you just feel massive in your t-shirts. Like there's such a psychological like desire for that for a lot of these people, on top of the fact that like some people are going to get some like joint relief from it as well. So like you have that subjective feeling of feeling better in the gym and feeling better under lifts, that I kind of start to see these unique properties on the psychosocial dynamic of coaching athletes is like why I even still see it around today. Is it's when you have someone that has that positive experience with a drug like that in play, it's going to become something they consistently use, and or a little bit more difficult to have them not use it, in my opinion. Yeah,
it's getting into like what effects should be coming from nandrolone. It's well known for like just some of the water retention that it can bring about, for good and bad. Like more water retention in general can make you feel fuller. It gives you the mental side of feeling bigger, and then can drive some of that pump process, which where's that all coming from? Well, it has a pretty strong interaction with aldosterone. So retain more water, right? Which my challenge back to that is that extra water productive? And from a psychological aspect, you can argue it maybe, but I think it could create a lot more negatives, because what we really want from hypertrophy is contractile tissue, not just water retention. But you're like, well, it improves leverages and I can lift more. It's like, but does just, lifting more weight necessarily mean more tension on the muscle, et cetera, et cetera? Hypertrophy mechanisms, look those up. The caveat, like the issue here is like with more water, more body weight, this is the most problematic aspect around bodybuilding in the off season. And when you have cycle designs that are affecting your ability to train, eat, or sleep, or manage health, these will quickly end your off season shorter than what you intended. So with extra like 10 pounds of water, not saying you're going to gain 10 pounds of water from nandrolone, but there are absolutely cycle designs that the guys running nandrolone and anadrol and a bunch of growth hormone insulin in the off season, and you're easily up 10 to 20 pounds of water, is that now your blood pressure's elevated. And also you're challenging your cardiovascular system more, and you're getting gassed out between sets. So now your work capacity is lower for training. Also, more body weight means poor sleep for a lot of individuals. You might have to crank up the pressure on the CPAP. And so that's becoming problematic as well. So these might be reasons why that extra water retention could be a poor aspect around Nandrolone. The other issues I see a lot of times with Nandrolone is why it's not my first go-to is it is a mess for managing gyno or managing libido. These are the common ones that I hear up, not the waters. That's like just more of a coaching assessment thing and also the health aspect I want to manage. But the first things that come up of like, oh man, I'm getting some like gyno, or man, my libido, like I can't get hard, or it's just not there. And man, lo and behold, usually I pull out Nandrolone and all that comes right back. And it's a complicated hormone because it has interactions with estrogen. It can raise up prolactin levels, and all those can influence libido and erectile function. So that's kind of one of the issues around just its management that get a little messy. So for the guys that like, hey, I've had a problem with Nandrolone in the past, usually I don't even go to it. But also for that reason, I don't go to it a lot because it's a lot harder to manage. But like you said, Luke, you have guys that have had good experiences with it. It's okay. It's okay to have it in place. It's not something that's off the shelf at all. People say like, I grow the most on Nandrolone. It's like potentially like maybe you could eke out a bit more growth out of Nandrolone, just off the anecdotals and what we see. But is it like, hey, I went from my 400 mgs of Primo and switched that to 400 mgs of Nandrolone, and all of a sudden I doubled my muscle gain? It's like, no, we don't see that. That doesn't happen. It's going to be a minuscule amount, and that's the trade-off here. Is that minuscule amount worth the potential other effects that Nandrolone brings with the water retention, gyno, libido problems, or whatever it may be, to manage that? The reason that we might not want to be using, might want to be sticking with Primobolan. Thanks everyone for tuning in to today's podcast. Are you struggling to hit your peak on show day? Feeling lost in the off season? Upgrade your coaching game with J3 University. Our program covers everything from off season to contest prep to peak week, all based from real client results. Along with our comprehensive physique curriculum, you'll also get access to our 4 rooms with our J3U team to answer any questions you have, and live Q&A sessions to further your coaching and athlete experience. We are the source of education for top IFBB pros and coaches. Join us to elevate the coaching standard at J3 University. Let's get back to today's podcast.
Yeah, I think that's kind of where it's like becoming air quote outdated too, is like the management of these off-site actions can be quite difficult. And we have drugs that we're going to be able to not have these off-site actions in Primobolan or Masteron, and use these as our primary bulk of stack design up to the needs of the athlete in their specific case. And that's going to be like the primary, I think, reason people start to kind of see this as outdated is when you look at the management of athletes over the long term and keeping them productive without these side effects. Not having something in play that has all these off-site actions is massive for the management of that. And I think it just makes things clear on the assessment side. It makes things easier to make sure that you're staying productive, and also to assess like the needs of the athlete. As when you coach athletes years after years after years, and that need for stack design to progress, it makes it a little bit easier, in my opinion, to know that as well.
I have coached some people where just access is limited.
Yeah.
And even some people that are like, hey, I'm not comfortable sourcing like underground gear or, and there's some like HRT clinics that they can prescribe test, can prescribe DECA. They can also prescribe Anavar. And they're like, these are the things I can get from my clinic, and that's what I can utilize. It's like, well, this is just the way it is and what we have. So that's a situation where we might utilize DECA. And I have used it for clients like in that situation. Yeah. It's like, that's just, and it's an access thing. It's just what is available.
Yep. 100%. I think, the other thing to consider too is like the fact that it's not off the table, and there is like the component of a slight synergy with testosterone as well, makes it a very viable compound to use if access is limited. So it's not like we're saying from a progress perspective, it's going to be worse for progress. It's just the management of it long term is going to be really tough if you're trying to get to like the upper echelons of physique development. And that's where, for me, the conversation starts to push it towards outdated.
I think if you are getting the higher stack design, needing more milligrams, it's going to be hard to fill it all in with just test and DECA, as usually there's limiters there around reaching side effects first and needing some other more benign compound side effect wise in place, like primobolan or masteron alongside of it. I've seen cycles where it's like test DECA and masteron work extremely well because it kind of manages some of the prolactin aspects with masteron in play. But again, it's like you're now kind of programming in your stacks ass backwards of like, well, how do I lower these negative effects that I'm getting from DECA? Oh, well, I add in this AI, I add in this masteron. It's like, well, why don't you just not use the DECA to begin with? It's like, oh, but man, I gained so much more. It's like, well, just try it. Why don't you just try a different stack to set up? And they're like, well, I didn't gain as much. It's like, well, yeah, because your last cycle, you did the same milligram amounts as you're doing for this current cycle. And that's something you need to consider, because I've heard this case of like, man, my last cycle, I grew more when I had Nandrolone in place. It's like, yes, your last cycle, like underline this, like you have to push the needle forward. You can't run the same milligram amount and think it's going to be like as much gaining as you did last time. Potentially there's a threshold there for sure. Yeah. But to make another consideration is like, you have to also be able to pull out the water aspect from your last cycle. It's like, oh man, I felt bigger when I ran Nandrolone. It's like, what does that even mean? Like, I felt bigger, like you had more water retention, but when that start drop off, like what does that actually look like for muscle gain? So like, if you're going to be exploring without using your Nandrolone, some other cycle design, make sure you consider those points. Because I have guys that are like, well, you know, these J3U guys are talking about Primo and Masteron. Let me try this out. And like, oh, that was shit. I didn't grow as much. It's like, well, yeah, man, you've been using steroids for 10 years and now you're running the same amount of milligrams and you just swapped out one compound for another. Like, it's not going to be some vast game changer difference here. But I would say what is maybe a changer is like, if you had problems with Nandrolone, could you better manage your side effect profile that way? One thing around these effects I do want to mention that we hadn't mentioned, Luke, was, you know, people bring up the joint connective tissue aspect with Nandrolone. It's a consideration point. What I would say as a whole, all these steroids do really close to the same things. So when you see like improved joint connective tissue and feel like your recovery is better, they're all doing this to a degree. I know people are like, well, Winstrol, like my joints and connective tissue fall apart. It's like, there's differences amongst them all. But as a whole, I can tell you, at least for myself and all my clients, like when you go on cycle, everything feels better joint connective tissue wise because recovery is improved. So I don't think DECA is unique in that sense. There is 2 studies on DECA or Nandrolone, I'll say, but they're used DECA on joint and connective tissue. One's in rabbits and the other one is in humans, but there's no control group. So they just give some guys some Nandrolone on top of their TRT. They're like, how do your joints feel? They're like, we feel amazing. It's like, yeah, of course, we all feel amazing now. So it's not the best like controlled study. And the one in the rabbits, it's not as much carryover to humans either. But anecdotally, you kind of can't deny it because everyone says, oh, I feel really good with my joints when I'm running Nandrolone. So if that is the case, it doesn't take a lot to do that, because even in that study, it wasn't much more that they added in, like 100 to 200 milligrams of Nandrolone could check the box for aiding joint connective tissue. So if that has an aspect of the feature that you have felt around Nandrolone, you don't need to add a lot in that small dosing range could also prevent some of the going down to the negative effects that you might be running into with Nandrolone. Yeah.
I think context is huge with it. There's also like an anxiety piece with it as well that could potentially be brought up. I've had quite a few that get into the elevated anxiety with it as well that is pretty robust. But again, I think it's like just summary of how beneficial is it for that athlete and the context as to why it's being ran, and can you replicate this with other drugs and manage it the same? It's more than likely yes.
Yeah, so it really, like with all of these injectables, it comes down to a pro and con list. And in the J3U lectures in our PED module on injectables, I have the 5 common injectables that you're going to use for steroids. And again, it's just 5. There's not a robust list here, of Primo, Mast, Nandrolone, Trenbolone, and Boldenone. Like, these are 5 common ones that you're going to see used. And I give you a pro and con list to weigh these out, because that's what it really comes down to. Not of like, you should never use this one, or you should always use this one. No, and it's so individual based around, someone's response, that it's about finding the right drug through you. And the only way you can do that is through some self-experimentation, kind of rotating through these and finding what gets along best for you and what you respond best with, not only result-wise, but also with managing your health too. So I think the modern bodybuilding approach is now taking a more thoughtful stack design and personalization to the choices that you're making with your compounds over the past of just cookie cutter cycle designs and using what past bodybuilders have used, and just without some type of assessment or asking questions of why should I be doing this and how do I monitor this. I think that's where we're pushing more into modern bodybuilding. And it's not that DECA or Nandrolone is a thing of the past. It's more part of modern bodybuilding, but it's more of a tool, and you use that tool based on your assessment that you've done with yourself and your clients to understand when to deploy that tool. So this is how I think we're making that shift from the past usage to now more modern usage.
Amen. I don't think I got much to add to that, brother.
I don't either. I think we will wrap it up there. If anyone out there listening to this on YouTube, if you have a steroid question you'd like us to answer on a podcast and do a deeper dive on it, let us know down below. Luke and I, we kind of default to training topics because honestly, I spend more of my time thinking about training than I do about PDs. I think it's more important. But nonetheless, we're happy to dive into more PED topics. So if there's one, please let us know. And then we will just talk to you next time otherwise.